War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 72, the 100-Year War and the Siege of Orleans. Joan of Arc and the Siege of Orleans are forever linked in both history and myth. It is impossible to discuss one without the other. And I suspect that Crecy's inclusion of this siege is a far more a nod to the disproportionate fame of its teenage protagonist than its actual decisiveness in history. It did, admittedly, mark the beginning of the end of the 100 Years' War, which itself needs to be understood, to put Joan and the siege into context. As noted in the discussion on the Battle of Hastings, the triumph of the Viking William and his claim to the English throne gave him claim of both Normandy in France and England in Britain, and this put the English monarch in the unique place of being a vassal of the King of France concerning his lands in the latter monarch's country, notably along the southern coast, on the English Channel in the regions of Normandy and Aquitaine. This arrangement worked well enough until Charles IV foolishly died with no male heirs and no brothers. This was problematic, and Edward III, aka Edward of Windsor, by virtue of his mother being the aforementioned Charles's sister, saw fit to declare himself king of both England and France. The Dukes of France had determined this simply would not do, and themselves appointed Charles's cousin as the king. And so, in 1338, this war for France commenced. The first key battle being, in my opinion, the far more interesting Battle of Crecy in 1346, when Edward clashed with now King Philip VI, following a several-month pillaging tour starting on the tip of the Continent Peninsula near Cherbourg, traversing within 2 miles of Paris, and swinging north to seize the key port of Calais, then controlled by the French. The strong English force was slowly attrited during this long march by battle, disease, and desertion, while the French were growing in strength, calling upon its levies to dislodge Edward's forces. Realizing that the French would catch them before they could re-embark at Calais, Edward decided to make a defensive stand near Crecy, rather than be run down as a disorganized army on the march. The French at this point heavily outnumbered the English by about 2-1, with a large advantage in heavy armored cavalry. But the English were armed with the now famous longbow and faced French crossbowmen. While counterintuitive, the crossbow was an inferior weapon whose complexity was offset by ease of training. It took years to train an English bowman. Edward's defensive position on the high point, combined with his bowmen, meant the opening battle of fires crushed the French crossbowmen. Philip, rather than bypassing the English defensive lines and trying to surround them and isolate them from their destination, decided instead to rely on the Gallic cavaliers to break the English lines, despite the muddy ground separating his cavalry from the Englishmen commanding the high ground. Repeated charges in the muck and fighting the rain of arrows all proved fruitless, and thousands of cavalry fell to an estimated 200 Englishmen afoot. Historians have estimated each longbowman had nearly 100 arrows at the start, with more supplied during the day. Ultimately, around 500,000 arrows were fired, providing more than enough firepower to overwhelm the French numerical advantage. And speaking of firepower, the English were likewise equipped with very early cannons, firing both shot and bundles of arrows. Little is known of their effectiveness, but it appears unquestioned that they were present and used at Crecy. Unburdened by the threat of a French pursuit, Edward laid siege to the French garrison at Calais, which surrendered soon after, realizing no French force existed to relieve the siege. Calais would remain in English hands for the next 200 years and would serve as the operational center of gravity for the English throughout the next century of intermittent warfare. The first phase of the 100-Year War, understandably called the Edwardian phase, ended with the Treaty of Brittany in 1360, where France, having been repeatedly thumped by the English, gave up significant land and rights to the English crown. In the midst of this Edwardian phase, the Black Death ravaged both England and France in 2 separate outbreaks. And while both suffered, France had the greater decline in population, and this unquestionably aided Edward's conquests. But by 1378, a rebounded French population and monarchy had reconquered much of Edward's gain, and this second, Carolinian phase lasted until the end of the 14th century. Interestingly, this was a war of attrition with few great battles fought on land, Instead, it was the Iberian Castillans allied with France, supplying their navy and raiding the English coast. England attempted to reinforce their weakened forces in France, but were soundly defeated by the Castilian sailors at the Battle of La Rochelle. The weakened English claims led to yet another treaty and a lull in the war, until the third Lancastrian phase kicked off in 1415, when the famous Henry V decided to reclaim his crown's ancient lands on the continent. 25 years of peace were interrupted when the young king landed his forces at Harfleur. The French knew an English invasion was imminent, and young Henry wished to secure secrecy over his true destination. Despite his youth, Henry had studied the previous campaigns and was well aware of the challenges ahead. He had identified several keys to victory. First, he needed a strong port in France to maintain his logistics. He could not supply the requisite army to reconquer France by mere pillaging. This was magnified by the use of castles throughout France at every major town. This necessitated both well-trained and equipped engineers with siege engines, and likewise, the logistics required to maintain a siege as long as necessary. In fact, his first conquest at Harfleur began with a siege immediately upon landing his forces. The siege lasted for months, with massive cannons bombarding the well-situated French, but eventually dysentery weakened the defenders behind the city's walls, and repeated calls for surrender were eventually accepted. England had scored her first victory, but not without significant cost. Henry, seeing the disease-ridden Harfleur as unsuitable as a base, decided to make for the still English-controlled Calais, abandoning his siege engines and hoping to save his army. The French pursued, and they met at Agincourt, where, yet again, the French horse-mounted nobility was crushed under a barrage of arrows loosed by English longbowmen. Too exhausted and, frankly, unequipped to pursue the defeated French, Henry was happy enough to make his escape and retreat back to England from Calais. Henry embarked 18 months later and focused on reconquering Normandy with great success. This campaign culminated in the Treaty of Troyes, when Princess Catherine of France was wedded to Henry and the French throne promised upon the death of the current king. Henry died soon after, and the infant Henry VI dutifully claimed the combined throne with the Duke of Gloucester, serving as regent and general. He continued the English conquest of France and conquered nearly all of northern France, with the Frenchman Charles controlling the south, having refused to accept the infant as monarch. The northernmost extent of French control was at Orleans, which the English besieged, hoping to continue their control. After decades of continued English dominance, there was little reason to think the French could maintain the town and their national sovereignty. Orleans was critical, as it was the capital of what was known as, fittingly, the House of Orleans, and colloquially as the Armagnac faction, as opposed to the House of Burgundy or Burgundian faction. Both were descended from the French line, with the latter Burgundians allied with the English. If Orleans fell, so would the political center of gravity of the Armagnacs, and, most probably, that of French independence. The House of Orleans was led by Louis I, youngest son of the former Charles V, whereas the Burgundians were led by Charles V's brother, Philip. The French King Charles VI, Louis's older brother and otherwise known as the Mad King, was some of the reason of the decline of the French holdings, but the bulk was the raging civil war between the two houses for control. The siege commenced in October of 1428. At first approach, the English focused not on the town, but on seizing and pillaging the countryside around it. The commander of the English, the Earl of Salisbury, determined a siege would be necessary and a direct assault against the town unwise. The city is dominated by the river Loire, which splits the town. The main crossing point was several miles downstream at Bougainville. It was this point that the Earl was determined to seize, and the island which allowed the crossing the wide river possible, and would allow him to secure the terrain south of Orleans and isolate it from Armagnac reinforcements. Having secured north, west, and south of the city, he then moved upriver to the east and successfully surrounded the town. The castle was on the north bank of the Loire, and the commander of the French defenders set up defenses along the shore and the innumerable tidal islands to ensure the English could not bring cannon easily to bear upon the walls. The gatehouse, called Tourelles, controlled the bridge from the south, and the French and English fought for its control initially, with the English eventually seizing it. It was during this battle that the Earl of Salisbury, technically the fourth Earl of Salisbury, was killed by an English cannon's recoil. This setback, combined with the arrival of French reinforcements slipping through the English cordon, paused operations. The new English commander, the Earl of Suffolk, abandoned the idea of bombardment and assault and decided to starve the defenders out. Too weak in forces to fully surround the city, he set up a series of forts to intercept any attempt to relieve Orleans. As the French were mostly situated to the south, the English dedicated most of their defenses there, with patrols in the north constantly moving to intercept any attempts by the French to reinforce. With the approach of winter, French sorties out of the city focused more on destroying any buildings the English might use for shelter. In February, the hilariously named Battle of the Herrings was fought as the French and allied Scots attacked a resupply column headed to the English forces at Orleans. The battle is so named because much of the supplies were the aforementioned fish. The battle itself was noteworthy as an example of combined warfare. The French had superior firepower, and the English supply column was frozen in hasty defense. The French wanted to use cannons to beat down the English, but the Scots, dissatisfied with such a slow and ungentlemanly approach, attacked and were beaten back. The confused French decided to follow, but not soon enough to help, this piecemeal attack being a violation of that principle of mass, and the victorious English logisticians were free to join their army at Orleans. At this, the French prince at Orleans was implored to seek a peace with the English and their Burgundian allies, and, by March, it appeared he was close to doing so. In March, John of Dunois made what he hoped was an irresistible offer to Philip III of Burgundy, offering to turn Orleans over to him, to hold his neutral territory on behalf of his captive half-brother, Charles, Duke of Orleans. A group of nobles and bourgeois from the city went to Philip to try to make him persuade the Duke of Bedford to lift the siege so that Orleans could surrender to Burgundy instead. The specific terms of the offer made are outlined in a letter by a contemporary merchant. Burgundy would be able to appoint the city's governors on behalf of the Duke of Orleans. Half the city taxes would go to the English, and the other half would go for the ransom of the imprisoned Duke. A contribution of 10,000 gold crowns was to be made to Bedford for war expenses, and the English would gain military access through Orleans, all in return for lifting the siege and handing the city to the Burgundians. This agreement would have given the English the chance to pass through Orleans and strike into Bourges, the administrative capital of the Dauphiné, which had been the primary motivator for the siege itself. Burgundy hurried to Paris in early April to persuade the English regent, John of Bedford, to take the offer. But Bedford, certain Orleans was on the verge of falling, refused to surrender his prize. The disappointed Philip withdrew his Burgundian auxiliaries from the English siege in a huff, and the Burgundian contingent left on 17 April, 1429, which left the English with an extremely small army to continue the siege. And now, so late in our tale is the time to tell the tale of Joan, but her story and the end of the siege of Orleans will have to wait until next week. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.